We're going to do an introduction about music, then there'll be an overview of Christian music history, taking us up, I guess, to the end of the 19th century. Next week, I probably won't do hymn books until week 3. Next week, what I'd like to do is to tell the story of the various hymn writers, the main hymn writers, and the story of some of the hymns. So we'll do that in the church, and we'll sing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll sing the hymns.
Lovely.
And then what I don't finish today, and the hymn books and a few other modern things, we'll do on week 3. Why me? Let me give you a little bit of background. Some years ago, I won a scholarship. Bob Carr, when he was Premier, used to hand out scholarships to historians to go to study in America, and then he widened it out, and then he got other people. Mine was actually paid for by Frank Lowy of Westfield. But I came back and I published the research under the heading of the Consolidation and Dissemination of American Rural Culture through Radio and Recordings in the 20s and 30s. Subtitled, Bob Carr gave me a lot of money to study hillbilly music. Now, Macquarie University got hold of it and said, we want you to do a PhD. And because Macquarie University are very big on music culture. And I was actually at my son's graduation. He graduated in English, but the professor of music came up to me and said, why haven't you started your PhD yet? And I was very tempted because I thought the idea of getting a PhD in music when you can't play an instrument, you can't read music and you can't sing would be fantastic. But in the end I decided that no, it wasn't possible. But I am a historian, so I can tell you about the history of it. I don't necessarily understand all the bits and pieces. But I warn you as a historian, nothing modern is of interest to me. So when we come to the 21st century, you may not be all that happy about what I say, but never mind. Now, musical appreciation is subjective. We won't all agree on music because everybody likes different things. And some people like classical music. I remember at school, we were told, listen to this piece, and listen to the fairies at the bottom of the garden. And all I wanted to ask the teacher was, what did you have on your cornflakes for breakfast? Because I want some. Because, I mean, that's ridiculous, fairies at the bottom of the garden. Some people like opera. You get this fat lady caterwauling stuff and you think, I can't understand a word of it. Why is she singing in Italian? Then somebody says she's actually singing in English, but I still couldn't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Some people like jazz. Now, jazz is where you get a whole lot of musical notes, throw them up in the air, and however they come down, you play it. Seems to me that's what makes sense. Some people like blues, which to me is what you play to get in the mood to commit suicide. Some people like musicals. Now, it doesn't appeal to me. I can't imagine walking through a cornfield, suddenly bursting into song, and the orchestra and chorus jump up and enjoy. It doesn't make any sense to me. Some people like pop, Bing and Frank and Perry, who seem to me almost to go to sleep halfway through the song, but that's another matter. Some people like rock. The early years was teeny bopper stuff, and then developed. You didn't have to have a voice, you just played it really loud. I mean, Johnny O'Keefe, Jimmy Barnes, really, truly. Some people like heavy metal. Heavy metal is music that the army used to train troops for being under machine gun fire. Some people like me like country music, where you go and pick up Grandma's dog, take him out to the jail where Grandma's just about to be let out, and on the way back your pickup truck gets belted by a train and she dies. It's good stuff. Some of us love that. Some people like rap music. I can't think of anything funny to say about rap music because it's not funny. Some people like a mixture of country and rap. It's called crap. Yep. You get the point, we're all different. Okay, and I can send it all up. And I only listen to country music. And I enjoy that, but I understand that some people don't like it, and that's fair enough.
Well, I actually think country music is music to slash your wrist by. That's how I view country
Fair
music.
enough. All right. I won't. You see,
No, I'm
the
teasing
thing
you.
is, we need to understand that everybody is different. And whilst I'm right, I've got to understand that you still have a right to your point of view. All right? And so as we talk about Christian music, we are going to differ. Now, I'll tell you what I think, but you don't have to agree with me. That's the thing. In theology, we have to agree. In music, no, we don't. All right, so the power of music. In 1 Samuel 16, we have a very interesting passage about the power of music. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendant said to him, "See, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen the son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." And Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them with his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armour-bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." Here's the key bit. Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul, and he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. So, even way back in the Old Testament, it's quite clear that music has power. It has power to do all sorts of things. It first of all affects your mood. So music can be used, for example, to not only deal with evil spirits, but to calm people down. There was a time in the 90s when the New South Wales Education Department had a group of people who were pushing the idea that you should play music in your classroom because it would calm down the students. Now, I'll tell you the truth, it doesn't work. We had an in-service day by the group who were promoting this, and it didn't calm down the teachers, let alone the students. That's the thing. In fact, 2 teachers got thrown out, and we went to the staff room and enjoyed a cup of tea and had a good chat. It was just a waste of time, and eventually the government banned it. But it's why you have music in lifts. You know, some people find it scary to get into a lift in a confined space, and you have music there to calm you down. In the supermarket, you know, music in the supermarket, you have it because apparently it calms you in your shopping.
I enjoy it in the supermarket.
I don't.
Oh, don't you? Oh, I do.
And some hospitals actually have calming music while you're waiting to go into the operating theatre. It improves performance. They've done studies. You actually play music to your cows and you get better quality milk and more of it. And chickens, apparently, it helps the egg laying. The only problem with that is there are 2 different studies. One says that if you play classical music it helps. The other says if you play pop music it helps. In the southern states of America, apparently if you play Dolly Parton you get better eggs. And it's a teaching tool. If you drag out a record from the late 1950s and play it, I can sing along, word perfect.
Yes.
And sometimes at the radio station I play something that I haven't actually listened to for 20 or 30 years. I sit there and sing along, have the microphone off of course, sing along, word perfect, because I can remember it. Now I can't remember what else I learned at school, but I remember the words of the songs. And I've told Nancy I'm going to say this, so she's okay with it. If I'm watching television, I say to Nancy, can you make me a cup of coffee? The answer is no. She's forgotten how to do it. If I say, can you find such and such? No. If I say, can you go and play some Baptist hymns on the piano? She plays them note perfect. Because music is one of the things that really is imprinted on your memory. And so it's very, very important to have music, and that's why it's important in a church service. So what about music in worship? We have real problems here, John. Nothing's working. Even that's not working. There we go. That's in the classroom. All right, music with the cows, music with the chickens. 50s, all right. Music in worship. Now, 4 things I want to say. The first is, the words are vital. They have to be theologically correct. Otherwise, it is not something you should have in church. So it's very important that the words are theologically correct. They don't have to be clever words. They just have to be consistent with what the Bible says. They need to be uplifting. They need to be praising God. They need to be reflecting on what the scriptures say. They shouldn't be about navel gazing. This is how I feel. That's not what music in worship is about. It needs to be common. I don't know what contribution is. It should be common, but never mind. What we do in worship should be something we do together. We're going to see through these lectures the tension between performance and participation. And the Anglican position, the Book of Common Prayer, is of participation. We must be able to contribute. That means that the tune has to be able to be sung. Now, there are some modern things that brilliant musically, but I frankly can't sing. Can't get anywhere near them. And the words have to be familiar. It's no point learning a new tune, a new hymn every week. It's very important that people are familiar with them, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Is there a new need for music to be contemporary? No. It doesn't have to be contemporary at all. Old hymns that are familiar and easy to sing are fine. When I was teaching at Penrith Christian School, we used to have a devotions every morning. 3 of us used to sit over in a corner. It was called the Grumpy Old Man's Corner because we never got on with what they did. It was a charismatic school. And one girl one day said, we're going to sing a chorus. Unfortunately, it's not new. It's an old one, but it fits what I want to say. And I looked it up. It was actually 3 years old. And I thought, that's crazy. We just throw stuff away. We use what's suited to what we're doing, regardless of when it was written. Whether it's old or new, if it suits what we're doing, that's what we use. I like the idea of the music fitting the sermon, because I see the sermon as the essence of the service. When I was rector of Annandale, I had a church warden who was the lead singer in a rock group. And he used to choose the music, and I'd let him know what the sermons were about for the whole year, and he'd go and choose the music. And sometimes he couldn't find anything that was appropriate. So he'd go and write one, which was an incredible talent. And he published them later on in books available. Now, what about the future? I actually fear for the future of church music. Because, you see, first of all, we don't use hymn books anymore. We stick them up on the screen, which means that we can sing anything we want. In the old days, you had a hymn book, and if you wanted to do something that wasn't in the hymn book, you had to go and get the Gestetner out and print a stencil and run it off. Now we don't have to worry about that. And so you're stuck with the hymn book. Now what bothers me is that now that we no longer are using hymn books and we're doing all sorts of different things, nobody does the same thing. So every time you go to a different church, you hear different music. And that's a problem. It's a problem for the illiterate. Right? If you can't read, you learn stuff off by heart. Or the elderly who can't see very well. I've told you before of the experience at Mount Druitt, where people would open the hymn book and sing lustily, loudly. The hymn book might be upside down because it didn't matter, because you knew they couldn't read anyway. They only held the hymn book there because they didn't want anybody to know they couldn't read. But because you had the same thing all the time. Again, when I was at Annandale, we introduced the new prayer book. And a lot of people didn't want it, but they went along with it. And we had it for about 12 months. And my wife took the ladies into the cathedral for a Mothers' Union service, where they used 1662, which these people have been using all their lives. And they came back and they said to me, that was a horrible service, we couldn't follow it. Because, you see, they couldn't read. They were blind, not able to. And they got used to the new service, learnt that, forgotten all about the old service, and they were lost. I've told you before of an experience that I had that I think is very, very significant. I was visiting Dollywood in the mountains of Tennessee. And Dollywood has three sections. It has the traditional theme park thing with all the rides and things. It has a southern culture section where they have people making lice soap and all that sort of thing. And it has an entertainment section, which includes the Museum of Southern Gospel Music and so on. And I went to a performance by a Southern Gospel group, four guys, and there were probably between 500 and 700 people there. I mean, it's a big place, they get big crowds. And it did an hour performance. And halfway through they said, well, now it's your turn. And they sang 3 songs at which they wanted the congregation or the audience to join in. And I sat there looking around and everybody was singing. It was an incredible experience, really uplifting experience. And after it was over, I was talking to the guys and I said, do you know, those 3 songs that everybody sang, I learnt those in Sunday school in Australia. Now the modern generation won't be able to do that because we all do different things. And I think that's a loss. I really do. So I actually fear that if we don't keep a lot of the old stuff going, or if we don't choose new stuff that everybody agrees on, we're going to lose that common touch with it. And I think that would be a pity. The Old Testament, I'll turn that off and I won't bother with it. The Old Testament suggests that music was invented by Jubal, the son of Lamech, in Genesis 4:21. But it's used for all sorts of different things. After victory in battle, noisy music and dance in Numbers, approach to a watering place during Exodus. Music is a sign of joy that we found, the oasis if you like. Played after victory, when David leads the ark into Jerusalem, there are lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals. We'll leave that for a moment. After victory in battle again, music, singing and dancing is associated with feasts, festivals, Isaiah 16:10, and marriage celebrations in Maccabees, which is one of the apocryphal books. The kings had singers and instrumentalists. The harlot increased her seductive powers with song in Isaiah. At times of mourning, David laments over Saul and Jonathan. So there are all sorts of different ways that music is used. Now, if you want me to give you any more detail, the answer is I have no idea, because we're not told. We're told it's used by that, but we don't know much more about it. But in 1 Chronicles 15:16 to 24, David organises a choir and an orchestra. So David told the leaders of the Levites to appoint their fellow Levites as musicians to make a joyful sound with musical instruments, lyres, harps and cymbals. So the Levites appointed Heman, son of Joel, from his relatives, Asaph, son of Berechiah, and from their relatives the Merarites, Ethan, son of Cushiah, and with them their relatives next in rank, Zans, and so on. So the musicians were to play the lyres according to the Alamoth, and others were to play harps, and one Levite was in charge of singing, so that was his responsibility. And then there were to be doorkeepers for the ark and so on. In other words, it was important enough for this to be a real detail of how it was done. But beyond saying this is what happened, we know nothing. And indeed, in a moment when we go through the instruments, we really know nothing. So there are no details. No details at all. We do know that the Psalms became the songbook of the Jewish church. And so the Psalms were used regularly, as they were in the Christian church. And they have instruments whose names are not clear. They are translated into English with words that normally mean something to us, but the instrument in the Old Testament was not necessarily like what we would see it as being. And we have no idea how most of them were made. So, for example, there were strings. The lyre was probably a harp. The authorised version translates it as a harp. Because there's no certainty on that, most modern versions just call it the lyre. So it was some sort of stringed instrument like a harp, let's put it that way. That's the best we can do. The psaltery, no idea what that was. The sackbut, no idea what that was. And the dulcimer was probably similar to a modern dulcimer, but we're not sure. Wind instruments, the pipe. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. I did take some notes. Again, the psaltery was a kind of harp. The sackbut probably was a small triangular bit that had 4 strings that you plucked. Now, that was probably a Babylonian instrument. The dulcimer was a form of bagpipe. Right? So the Scots didn't invent it. Now, the pipe is the same as a flute or an oboe or a clarinet. It's something that you blow across the holes. The flute means a whistle. The organ probably covers all of the wind instruments. We're not sure. The horn was a flask for carrying oil and also a trumpet. It's the same word. The trumpet was made out of animals' horns. And later on, when they became a little more sophisticated, beaten silver. And the cornet was also a type of horn. The percussion bells, they are. Cymbals, literally a bowl or a hollowed out plate, and you bang them together just as you do today. And the timbrel, or the tabret, was a tambourine, like the modern tambourine held and struck with a hand. Now that's as close as I can get. As close as I can get. It would appear in the Old Testament that music began almost as an ecstatic thing, something that you did sort of just out of pure joy, and then gradually it became more formal. Gradually it involved symbolism of what you were doing, and in the service it became more and more formal. Outside it remained a mixture of the two. Now, I can't tell you much more than that. Done all the research I could, and the words in the Hebrew just don't have an English translation. I thought we might have an aside at that point talking about instruments and talk about the organ. Now the organ has two purposes. I love those pictures. First of all, 1, 2, 3, 4 keyboards, and look at all the stops on the side, and then look at all the pipes. Incredible instrument when you think about it. But let's have a look at the organ. The purpose, it's twofold purpose. It's to accompany singing, and it's a solo instrument. It's a very powerful solo instrument, but in church its purpose is to accompany singing. And as such, it's probably far too complex in that form that was on the screen there. Far too complex. It needs to be simple. Now, what's the history of the organ? It was invented in 200 BC. You didn't know it was that old, did you? But it was just a whole lot of tubes with water at different levels, and you blew across the top of it. That's the original organ. And it was designed to teach hydraulics, and then they discovered it made a good sound, and so it began to be used. But then again, what happened was that it then developed into a musical instrument, and although not like we know it, in a primitive form, in the 7th century it was used in churches. But it was used as a drone, that is a single note played in progression, to accompany chants, because services were chanted. And the music was therefore just a single note, different levels to go with the chant. We'll talk about chanting again in a minute. By the 14th century, sophisticated organs were being used in cathedrals and monasteries, and they were used to accompany choirs, because in medieval times worship had become quite elaborate. Now, in the Reformation, they declined in use. Calvin was suspicious of them. Luther supported them. John Knox removed them. They continue to be used in cathedrals and royal chapels. You had choirs, choral services and anthem, but not in the parish church. In England, for example, in 1534, monasteries were dismantled and the organs were destroyed. Under Elizabeth, they were not replaced. And organ building in England didn't really begin again until 1660, after the Commonwealth period. During the Commonwealth period, they were removed from the churches, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. In Scotland, let me quote an ordinance in Glasgow of 1807. The use of organs in public worship of God is contrary to the law of the land and to the law and constitution of the established church. So it's illegal to have an organ. That's the bottom line. In Scotland, they were confined to Catholic and Episcopal churches and a few chapels of the minority sects, but the Church of Scotland, you did not have an organ. In 1866, the General Assembly of the Church in Scotland declared that there was no objection to having organs. And so by 1906, about 90% of churches have organs. Now you have to understand Scotland, it's a fascinating place. There's a joke of a lady whose local Presbyterian church, Church of Scotland Church, put an organ in, and she stopped going. And one day the minister saw her down in the street in the shopping centre, and he said, Mrs. Brown, how are you? You haven't been to church for a long time. She said, no, I'm going to the Methodist church now. And he said, well, why? And she said, well, when you put the organ in there, I stopped going. And he said, yes, but the Methodists have an organ. He said, oh yes. She said, oh yes, but it's not right to have one in the house of God. think that probably says a lot about the Scots. The present situation is that they are declining in usage. As churches close, and churches are closing in large numbers, particularly in England and Scotland, the cost of relocating an organ is too great, and so they are just destroyed. Repair and tuning costs are great, and so a lot of churches simply say, well, it's just not worth keeping them. We had an organ at Annandale, very good organ, but in Sydney Diocese there was a guy who went around converting organs to the new electronic thing, and every organ he touched he wrecked. People didn't know it for 10 years, but we reached the point with ours where the guy that came in to tune it said, look, I've tuned it. He came to see me, he said, look, I've tuned it, but he said, first of all, don't tell anybody it was me that did it, and secondly, don't ask me back, because I can't get it right. It's really hard. And so I bought an electric one. And that was a story in a lot of churches. Organists are not being trained. And an organ is different to a piano. So people get taught to play the piano, but there's no great call for organists anymore. Electronic organs are cheaper and easier. When something goes wrong, you replace them, it doesn't cost as much. And the other reason, and sorry Judy, close your ears, frankly most of the time organists are a pain in the you-know-where. And we haven't got that problem here. We've had a lot of organists here and they've all been great and easy to work with, and Christians and everything else. But at Annandale I had to sack the organist. And I discovered as I talked around, it was just a common problem. They were absolutely hopeless because they saw everything as being around them. When I was catechist at Darling Point, the organist there used to play too slowly. I remember one night the choir finished the hymn a verse and a half before the organist. I was so fed up with it. So organs have really stopped being used. Now, if you think what I said about the Old Testament was a bit lacking in detail, the New Testament is even worse. We know almost nothing about how worship was conducted in the New Testament church. We know that it still followed Jewish patterns, and so it contained scripture reading, teaching, prayer and singing. But probably the singing was unaccompanied. We don't know for sure, but remember they didn't have churches, they met in homes and so on. It was probably unaccompanied. It was developed from Judaism, from Jewish roots, and probably chanting was part of the service because that's what the Jews did. Beyond that, we're not told anything. Except, of course, for those famous verses in Ephesians and Colossians. Speaking to one another with psalms, hymns and songs from the Spirit, sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. And let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns and songs of the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. Songs from the Spirit is the New International Version. The older version simply says spiritual songs. And people used to say, well, yeah, you have psalms, you have hymns, and you have the modern stuff. That's not what it means at all. What's a hymn? We know what psalms are. And what's a spiritual song? Now, there's a girl who's just written a book, it hasn't been published yet, looking at modern culture and how it affects what happens with music in church. And she talks about how individualism has become so big that we no longer are involved in corporate things. J.B. Phillips says, let Christ's teaching live in your hearts, making you rich in true wisdom. Teach and help one another along the right road with your psalms and hymns and Christian songs, singing God's praise with joyful hearts. And whatever you do, do in the name of the Lord Jesus, thanking God the Father through him. I put that in because teach and help one another along the right road with your psalms, hymns and Christian songs, I think is actually a very good translation of teach and help, teach and admonish one another. It puts it very clearly. Now this girl said, look, here's the situation. You've got God, Christian, and you can see I'm no good with diagrams. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly. It begins with God, it comes from God to you. So it's got to be based on the Scriptures. It's not based on the Scriptures, it's not honouring to God. But then, Christian to Christian, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns and songs of the Spirit. The idea is that as we sing, we actually sing together to each other and we lift each other up. And it's this thing that you can't measure, this feeling of community spirit when people sing together. The thing that I mentioned about Dollywood, sitting there with a bunch of people I had never met, never seen, will never see again, and singing together the same thing. It's just an incredible experience. We need to do that. And teaching and admonishing, we'll come back to that in a little while because it's the key to some of the stuff. And then you do it with gratitude in your hearts to God. And what this girl was saying in her book is that the three things have to go together. It has to be biblical, it has to be designed to teach and admonish one another, and it has to be with gratitude to God. And I think that's not a bad explanation of those passages. Now, what is a hymn? In the New Testament, scholars say there are many hymns. They disagree on what are hymns, which passages are hymns, because of course it was written in Aramaic, translated into Greek, sung in Aramaic, translated into Greek, and then translated into English. And so it's not clear whether it's a hymn. But they've isolated things that they think were hymns, that is, things that were at least read together by the congregation, if not sung or chanted in some sort of way. The first definition of a hymn that I could find was from Augustine. A hymn is a song containing praise of God. If you praise God but without song, you do not have a hymn. If you praise anything which does not pertain to the glory of God, even if you sing it, you do not have a hymn. Hence a hymn contains the three elements: song, praise and God. That's the first definition I could find. And it's not a bad one when you think about it. The three things are necessary for it to be a hymn. Now if we move on to the early church, we know even less. The first 3 centuries, we have copies of liturgies, or at least bits and pieces of them, but there's no detail of anything, and certainly nothing in the music. The only suggestion, looking at writers, is that it was quite subdued. Dancing and instrumental music was associated with debauchery and immorality, and so the church didn't want much to do with it. That's a hangover from the Roman Empire, and so it was subdued. Beyond that, we know nothing. It just doesn't exist. Middle Ages to the Reformation. Ignatius of Antioch, we know, established choirs, and Ambrose of Milan wrote hymns to be sung by the congregation. We know very little else. Some of those hymns have survived. We know that in the medieval and Renaissance periods, chants were used. Now, a chant was I suppose, a form of singing, but it was one person leading it. Sometimes the congregation would repeat what was going on. There were thousands of different chants. The key one was the Gregorian chant. It was unaccompanied. It was in Latin, up to 12 different modes, and traditionally choirs of men and boys. You didn't have women's voices. So if you had an accompaniment, it was with a choir. You didn't have musical instruments. Now, there are other forms of ancient chants which still exist. The Gregorian chant exists because it's still the basis of what happens in many Roman Catholic churches. All right, now we don't know anything about the details of those chants. We know modern chants, and I can't do it. I can't sing, so it's a waste of time even trying to show you what a chant is. But you've probably been to services where they chant, and depends on the quality of the person taking it, I suppose. Now, one of the reasons we know nothing is, of course, there's no recording and there's no written record of the music because there is no way to record it in writing. Notation doesn't begin until around about 1000 AD. So if you were learning a chant prior to that, you learn it by listening to it. You couldn't pass from one place to another unless the teacher went and did it. Now, the original notation was developed so that choirs could sing without actually having heard it beforehand. It was very, very simple. And from what I can understand, there was no information about the duration of notes. It was simply, the pitch of the note. But over a long period, it developed into what we use today, which some of you can read, which I can't read. Well, I can actually. I can look at it and say, yeah, that's a long tune, but that's all I know. Now, during the medieval period, polyphony developed. It was developed in detail for the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was been in the news having just been rebuilt after the fire, in the 12th century. But we know that there are examples of it at least 100 years before that. Now, a definition of it: the style of simultaneously combining a number of parts, each forming an individual melody and harmonising with each other. So polyphony is where you get different things coming together. So in a choir, you have people singing different notes and they come together and form a melody. It's complex. And of course, most modern classical music is polyphony. When I was courting Nancy, she had a subscription to the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and so of course I went along. Country music fan in the Opera House, yeah, right. Up until that time I had been to the Opera House. I went to see Buck Owens and the Buckaroos, but anyway. And after we were married I still went. And we used to sit up looking down on the orchestra. And whilst she appreciated the music, what I found fascinating was watching how the different parts came together to make the music. I sat there fascinated by, these people, and it was fascinating to see how it all came together. And that's polyphony. And of course you've got to be pretty clever to do that, I think, anyway. Now, that's complex music, and in the medieval period, that's what you got. The Orthodox churches, I just want to spend a few moments on those because then I'm going to leave them aside. They still have their own musical tradition, and it's a very strong tradition. Related to the liturgy, and the liturgy is sung, and there are different traditions. The Byzantine tradition, which is Turkey and all that area, was very much based on Jewish music and was seen as a window to heaven and was taken really seriously. In the Greek Orthodox churches, liturgy is sung and chanting is the most important part. But for them, hymns are important, and they have over 60,000 hymns that they use in the Greek Orthodox Church. And the Russian Orthodox Church is entirely different. It still uses traditional Russian music, but it's a hybrid of the traditional music and popular music from each period. And so it keeps developing, and it's distinctively Russian. So the Orthodox churches have a tradition of their own, and since that doesn't affect us, I'm not going to spend any time on that. Now, what happened in the Middle Ages is that while polyphony was developing, music was becoming more and more complex, spirituality was declining. And the Middle Ages were often called the Dark Ages for that. And so John Wycliffe came along. He died in 1384, and he died peacefully, and I put exclamation marks because he's one of the few people in those days who challenged the church who died peacefully. He usually got burnt at the stake. But I want to spend a bit of time on him because he is the one who's suddenly, he's a forerunner of the Reformation, but he's the one who jumps in and says, whoa, hang on, we're going in the wrong direction. Now, he attacked 5 things in particular. Temporal riches, the church becoming rich. He thought it was wrong for the church to be rich. The church had a role to look after the poor, not to look after itself. The sale of indulgences, which you'll remember is what started the Reformation when Luther published the 95 Theses against indulgences, which is buying your way to heaven. The doctrine of transubstantiation, where the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. Papal supremacy, which was traditional then, and the Bible not being in English. He wanted the Bible in English. He began to translate it. Tyndale came along later and did it. And you look at those things, they're the doctrines of the Reformation. They're the very things that the Reformation was formed on. So what did Wycliffe say about music? Very interesting. In the old days, men sang songs of mourning when they were in prison in order to teach the gospel, to put away idleness and to be occupied in a useful way for the time. But those songs and ours do not agree, for ours invite jollity and pride, and theirs led to mourning and dwelling on God's law. A short time later, vain tricks began to be employed: descant, contra notes, organum, and bouquettes, which is sharing short notes between 2 singers. So you might have one word and one singer will sing the first part, another singer will sing the second part. The word actually means hiccup, which is what it sounded like, which stimulate vain men more to dancing than mourning. And there are 40 or 50 in a choir, 3 or 4 proud and lecherous rascals perform the most devout service with flourishes so that no one can hear the words, and all the others are dumb and watch them like fools. Now, very interesting, but you see, what he's actually saying is music is no longer helping worship. It's become so complex and so much of a performance that it doesn't lead to worship. And whilst it may sound good and you may want to dance to it even, it's not helping. And that's what the Reformers are going to pick up on. But I think it's very interesting that so long before the Reformation, you have Wycliffe saying those things. Now we come to the Reformation, and the 2 key people were Luther and Calvin. In services, they changed from Latin services, which were complex, to a simpler service in the local language. Luther was German, Calvin started in France, then went to Switzerland. In the Reformation, the congregation was more involved. And singing became a much more significant part of the service, because that's how you got the congregation involved. Now, Luther and Calvin agreed on a number of things. They agreed that music is a tool of teaching. That comes back from Ephesians and Colossians. But it's very important. Music is a tool of teaching. Music must be understandable. So they're talking about singing. You have to know what you're singing about, or you don't sing in Latin. And therefore, it has to be congregational. They have to all be involved. It has to be in the vernacular, the language of the people. It's a teaching tool, and therefore new hymns were needed. Now, the two big issues were normative versus regulative. Luther believed in the normative. I don't know what I've got there. No, I don't. All right. Let me explain that. Luther said this, I quote, "What the Scripture forbids not, it allows. What it allows is not unlawful. And what is not unlawful may lawfully be done." In other words, you can do anything you like as long as the Scripture doesn't forbid it. So that gives the Lutherans a great deal of artistic and creative freedom. And so they used the organ, they used other instruments. Luther himself wrote at least 37 hymns. And the first Lutheran hymnal in 1524 had 8 hymns written by Luther. The most famous, of course, "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," which we'll play next week. So the normative is where you can do anything you like as long as it's not forbidden by Scripture. The regulative, which is the John Calvin position, is everything has to derive from Scripture. So if it's not biblical, you can't do it. So the Psalms become central to everything that you do. And the only other hymns that you sing are hymns which are based almost entirely on the text of the Scripture. Calvin actually, very interesting, he used children's choirs. He wanted lots and lots of children's choirs because he said they would teach adults by their simplicity, their childlike devotion, and their sincerity. And so he wanted choirs for that reason, of children. The third person there is Zwingli. Zwingli said you don't have worship in music. You don't have music in worship under any circumstances. And so in the Zwinglian churches there was no music, which is interesting because Zwingli himself was an accomplished musician. But he said, no, it's not what you have for. Now remember, books were expensive, so it's learnt by heart. And in Germany in particular, there was a big push for education. And schools were attached to churches. And part of the curriculum, a very important part of the curriculum, was to teach boys to sing so they could lead the congregation. The Genevan Psalter translated the Psalms into French and then set them to music. Now, I'll mention here, I don't know whether it's in the notes later, it doesn't matter. There's a problem. The Psalms were written in Hebrew, so they have to be translated. If you translate them literally, they don't make sense to read, so you have to do a little bit of fooling around. But then if you want to set them to music, you have to do a lot more fooling around. And so psalms that are translated to be sung are generally a long way from the original biblical text. In AAPB, the first Australian prayer book, the psalms printed in that were printed to be sung, and music was put to them. It was Australian translation and Australian music. And when I was looking after South Beecroft, I said to them, you can't read the Psalms from the prayer book. We'll read it from the Bible, because you'll find the prayer book Psalms are wrong. Probably misleading in some places, because they are written to be sung. We'll go back to the Bible and read what's in the Bible. And so where you have the Psalms put to music, you have a translation that sort of wanders a little bit. In Scotland, John Knox fixed it all. Psalms is it, nothing else. We'll come back and look at English after we've had a 10-minute break. In England, the Book of Common Prayer had very little guidance on music. Morning and evening prayer contained canticles, which were from the text, the song of whatever, you know. I forget what they're called, doesn't matter now. Nunc Dimittis and the Tedium, but Tedium, sorry, Tedium is better. But, and they were sung. We used to sing those even in a good evangelical church.
At even sung.
But very little information on hymns. Nothing about hymns. The services were changed into English, so the old musical traditions were not possible. So the English church had to completely rethink everything it was doing. Now, Elizabeth enjoyed pomp and ceremony, and music was important, and she really wanted to have things sort of... Polyphony was great, but of course most of the organs had been destroyed, so she didn't have much chance. But the common worship meant that the congregation was more involved in singing, and everything was similar. Was simple. Now, let me finish the Reformation with a summary. Catholic Church, music was mostly performance. The congregation was not involved, and words were less important than the mood created. Because remember, the service is still in Latin, so nobody knows what's going on anyway. That's why, of course, at the point where the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ, they ring a bell. So you'll know that's the point at which it happens. In the Calvinist tradition, the congregation was fully involved. It was not a performance. The words were vital. They were used for teaching. They should be biblical. And the Lutheran was a mixture of both. And so for the next 150 years, the Lutheran tradition was by far the richest of all of the musical traditions. In the post-Reformation situation, there were changes to the Roman Church. The Council of Trent was what's called the Counter-Reformation, and some of the worst things that happened in the church disappeared, but many of the things remained and remain to this day. The Lutheran Church developed with a very strong musical tradition, which eventually died, and the Orthodox churches went their own way. Now, from this point on, I only want to focus on what affects us. All right? There's a huge amount you can go and do. You know, there's a tradition in the Spanish church of music, which is quite spectacular. There's all of the stuff that happens in the Orthodox churches. But none of those have any impact on us, so I don't want to deal with those. I want to focus just on what affects us, which begins with the Lutherans, because they did have an influence on us. Now, they had a large number of composers writing hymns, choral music and orchestral music, which was okay in the Lutheran Church, not in the Anglican Church. There were a number of composers, Melchior Vulpius, Michael Pretorius, and Johann Kruger, who was very prolific and whose material is actually still used in Lutheran churches, and some of it would have made its way into English. Organ music was important, and they had the world's best organ builders. Well, it's Germany, they had the world's best everything, but certainly they were the world's best organ builders. they had great composers, a lot of them. The most important, of course, was Johann Sebastian Bach. They employed cantors, who were singers of liturgical music, and often they would sing a line and the congregation would respond. So in the days when literacy was still not high, when books were expensive still, that's the way you learned things, that's the way you did it. So the cantor would sing a line, the congregation would respond. At least the congregation are involved. It raised the quality of church music quite dramatically, and the worship experience was enhanced. And so, if you went to a Lutheran church in the 100 years after the Reformation, it would have been quite a spectacular worship experience. These days in the Lutheran church, it's not much different to our church. Indeed, in America, when I preached in the Lutheran church, I could have actually said most of the service anyway, because it was pretty much the Anglican service. But they did have a period of great conflict. Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the greats, but you need to be aware that as a composer, he was only known locally. His work was not widespread while he was alive. He was known more as a performer. He went and played the organ all over the place, but more importantly as someone who fixed and tuned organs. And so he would go and he would fix your organ or he'd tune your organ, and then he'd play it and do a concert with it to show how good it was. And that's what he was known for, not for his compositions. And indeed, a lot of people didn't like his music. God save us, my children, it's just as if one were at an opera comedy, somebody said about his church music. Apparently he was not an easy person to get along with. Got into lots of disagreements about all sorts of things. One was where he was told that he played for too long. So the next week he played for 2 minutes and left. A man after my own heart, I have to say. He was seen as a craftsman, not a creator. But now, of course, he's appreciated for his greatness. He was, in fact, a musical genius, but people at the time didn't know that. I'm not going to say much more about Lutheran musical development because eventually it died out, and which is a great pity. The Moravians were I'm going to say a bit about it, all right? A pietist movement which started in Germany, but their emphasis was on personal experience over theology. You might say a forerunner of the charismatic movement. It's not quite true, but they published thousands of hymns and songs. But because they were personal, most of it hasn't lasted. So I can't think of any Moravian hymns that we sing, even though they produced a whole lot. But they were very, very influential. For example, next week when we look at Charles Wesley, probably one of the greatest hymn writers of all time, he was influenced by the Moravians. John and Charles Wesley were converted through their Moravian experience, and his music was very much influenced by that. The decline in German music then, at the end of the 18th century, the Lutheran music was in decline. Pragmatism led to the increase in education as education rather than as singing, and choir schools became simply a nuisance, and so were closed down. Congregational singing increased in importance, but then they didn't have enough trained leaders to teach them, and so and to lead them, and so it just gradually died out, and it's no longer as great as it was. Go to England, which is really what interests us most of all. The Commonwealth period. You remember that Charles I was beheaded and England became Presbyterian under Cromwell. 2 ordinances of the Lords and Commons assembled in Parliament for the speedy demolishing of all organs, images and all matters of superstitious monuments in all cathedrals and collegiate or parish churches and chapels throughout the Kingdom of England and the Dominion of Wales, the better to accomplish the blessed Reformation so happily begun, and to remove all offences and things illegal in the worship of God. Right? And that includes organs. And so the Commonwealth period they went through with great enthusiasm, destroying organs, along with all the other things in the churches that they didn't like. So during that time then, the prayer book was illegal, and so the service was an introductory prayer, readings, a psalm, prayers, a sermon, prayers, an optional psalm, and a blessing. Now, if you've ever been to a Presbyterian church, all you got to do is throw a couple of hymns in there and you have the Presbyterian service of today. And indeed, I noticed at the church that we used to own, my daughter was there earlier in the year and had a photograph of it, and I think they had 6 hymns. The service is often called a hymn sandwich. You have a hymn, an introduction, a hymn, a prayer, a hymn, a sermon, a hymn. Anyway. The psalm singing was musically quite tuneful, and it was you can understand what was going on, and they had their own psalm book, their own version of the Psalms. And quite often in churches, if people were illiterate, the leader of the service would read a line of the psalm and then the people would sing it. So there was that sort of common thing. But the Commonwealth period came to an end in 1660, and in 1662 the Act of Uniformity meant that everybody in England did the same thing. There was a new Book of Common Prayer, which is the one we used up until recently. But organs had gone, and choir libraries had been destroyed. And indeed, one of the areas of music scholarship today is a rediscovery of the music of the pre-Commonwealth period. And they are finding it, in vaults and all sorts of places. They are finding some of that music. But in 1662, it just wasn't around. Parish church music was very poor. In the big churches, you had the landed gentry and the educated class, but in the rural church, you had uneducated people who had no idea what they were doing, who didn't really have a clue how to sing or anything like that, and there was nobody to teach them. Where they used instruments, they used the instruments of town bands. Right? There's no organ. The church is poor, so you've got a town band. Every town has its own band, and those instruments were brought into church to accompany the singing. Even the cathedrals had a problem. They had financial problems, and so they couldn't afford musicians, or they couldn't afford to offer enough to attract good ones, and so cathedral music declined quite substantially. There's a thing called the Chapel Royal, which is a chapel set up basically for the king to worship in. Began in the 13th century. There is, I think, a modern example of it. It moved around in all sorts of places. Charles II rather, who came to the throne after the Commonwealth period, he was very keen on trying to revive the music, and so he paid to send musicians abroad, particularly to Germany, to bring those traditions back to England. So in the Chapel Royal, You had an Anglican chant for the service, you had the canticles sung, and you also had anthems, which of course the parish church didn't have, because you had nobody to do it. And the chapel was, continues to today. It became very influential. Most important person in those days was Henry Purcell, who musicians will have heard of. Even I'd heard of him, which means he must have done something all right. He began as a chorister, along with his brother and his uncle, and his father. They were all choristers. At the age of 18, he was given the job of composer for the king's violins. And he wrote anthems. They were very complex. They were experimental. They weren't traditional at all. And he wrote secular music. He's best known for his secular music. Most of his church music we don't know much about. He never wrote church music for the ordinary church. It was always for the cathedral, the big choir and so on. One scholar has called him the greatest musical genius England ever had. But now we get on to what really is of interest to us, because it's the bit that affects us most of all. In the 17th and 18th century, they were high on worship, low on spirituality. In other words, back like before the Reformation, worship services were quite ornate, but the life of the church was very poor. The evangelical revival of the late 18th, early 19th centuries revived the church, gave it new life. And music was an important part of that. Now, prior to that, music really was only for wealthy or big churches, or it was performed in private. The ordinary parish church didn't really have much interest in music because they couldn't produce it, they couldn't perform it, they couldn't lead it. It was mostly biblical texts. But then came new hymns in English for people. Started with Benjamin Keach, a Baptist, and his hymns caused a schism in the Baptist church over what he was doing and how he was writing them, because, you know, he was moving away from just doing the Psalms. It was later repaired. In 1697 he published 73 hymns, one or two of them which still survive, and he defined the hymn as a devotional poem of human composure intended for corporate worship. So here's really where it began, but of course it developed under Isaac Watts, the father of English hymnody. Now, the first thing he did, he composed hymns in the standard metres of the Psalms. So you could put his poems to a variety of tunes. Very clever. He didn't have to write his own tunes. I'm going to talk a lot more about him next week, as we'll sing a couple of his hymns. He wrote more than 400 hymns. In fact, to figure, some books I've read say over 1,000, but anyway. The big thing was they were simple and straightforward. You know, when I survey the wondrous cross, it's a very, very simple hymn. Incredible hymn, but it's very simple. Nothing complex about it. And so he said things like, I make no pretences to the name of poet or polite writer. I am ambitious to be a servant to the churches and a helper to the joy of the meanest Christian. And I would neither indulge any bold metaphors, nor admit of hard words, nor tempt the ignorant worshipper to sing without his understanding. In other words, the whole point of him was to write stuff that would teach the congregation that they could sing. And he did that brilliantly. I'll talk more about him next week. He was not Anglican. He was a Congregationalist. As a result, he couldn't go to university. because only Anglicans could go to university, and he lived a very interesting life. But as I say, more next week. In the 18th century, there were more than 450 metrical psalters published and more than 250 hymn books. So you see the Psalms still are predominant, but hymns are being written, more than 250 hymn books in the 18th century. I looked at, when I want to talk to you in the third week about hymn books. If you look at the hymn books that have been published, you end up, if you go to, I think, 8-point print, you end up with about 40 or 50 pages of them in 2 columns. It's just phenomenal, the number of hymn books that have been published. Now, the thing about it was, the tunes varied. We still don't have a complex notation. Most hymn writers wrote the words, didn't worry about the tune. And so if you wrote words like Watts that other tunes could be fitted to, that was good. Otherwise somebody had to write the music for the tunes. There was no copyright, and so everybody that produced a hymn book changed the words to suit themselves. You know how much I get angry about word changes to the hymns. Well, it may well be we don't have the original of some of them because they were changed so often. Only later on did we start to get the original words. But every hymn book was different. Choirs developed to help people sing. The SPCK, the Society for the
Propagation.
Propagation, that's right. I was trying to promulgation, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge began to start schools all over the country, and music was an important part of the curriculum, so the students could help with congregational singing. Not like the Germans, where the students were taught so they could lead the congregation. Students in these schools were taught so that they could actually join the congregation and help them along. City churches had new organs and trained choirs to help people sing. Now, the choir is there not to perform but to help people sing. And that's the reason a lot of churches don't have choirs, because they're unhelpful. At Darling Point, the choir were all seated behind the pulpit, and they used to turn the lights off, which was good, and just shine the spotlight on the preacher, but if you watch the choir, they were doing all sorts of things while the sermon was on. And, I remember, I was just a student, I was never going to do it, but I remember Jim Wilde, who was the rector, quite often in his sermons would stop, turn around and say, "Oi!" and then go back to his sermon. Lovely English guy. But new organs were being built, and indeed some of the great organs of the world were built in England in those days. A lot of them came to Australia. Rural churches were poor, they had no organ, no choir, and the big problem was that people in the rural churches didn't travel. You know, if you're born into a rural English village, you probably died there. Not many people left it. So you had no experience of what other people were doing, you had no experience of new ideas, so you were still singing the old psalms, probably of the pre-Reformation days. But later, as in the 18th century, you got musical instruments being accepted to help singing, and so the rural churches could afford those. They might not be able to afford an organ, but they could afford other things like the bassoon and the cello, the wind instruments, and there was a vamp horn that was like a megaphone that was used. I mean, you think about it, and you look at those English churches from a period, and you see them on Midsummer Murders and that sort of thing, they're huge. There's no microphone. I mean, much bigger than our church. There's no amplification. And that's just church. Of course, if you go outside church, Dwight Moody preached to 30,000 people without amplification. Whitfield and Wesley used to preach to the miners as they were coming home from work, and they'd get thousands in the field. They obviously had much better voices than most of us have. What was it like? Well, here's from Adam Bede, book by George Eliot. Presently the sound of the bassoon and the key bugles burst forth. The evening hymn, which always opened the service, had begun. The interior of Hayslope Church was free from the modern blemish of galleries. The choir had two narrow pews to themselves in the middle of the right-hand row, so that it was a short process for Roshua Ran, the parish clerk, to take his place among them as principal bass and return to his desk when singing was over. None of the old people held books. Why should they? Not one of them could read. But they knew a few good words by heart, and their withered lips now and then moved silently, following the service without any clear comprehension indeed, but with a simple faith in his efficacy to ward off harm and bring blessing. So that's a novel, but that's an example of what it was like in the early church. It's hard for us to really understand what it was like in rural England in those days. We don't have anything remotely like it. Friedrich Handel needs to be mentioned as one of the great musicians. He was a German. He arrived in England in 1710. He wrote secular operas, and he wrote church music for state occasions, and he wrote oratorios for Lent. They're operas without staging, just the music. Other composers copied him. He was very influential. He wrote The Messiah for a charity concert in Dublin. His first London performance was in 1743. It's a lot more popular now than it was then. It didn't make much of a splash when he did it then. And of course he wrote music for some of Charles Wesley's hymns. So 18th century, Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, John Newton, Anne Steele, William Cowper, Philip Doddridge, Benjamin Badone, John Rippon, and a whole lot of others. We'll talk about them next week. I'll tell you their life story, where it's relevant, and we'll sing one or two of their hymns. Now the Wesleys are very important, and they had the view that everyone, not just the Calvinist elect, had the right to salvation and eternal life. So, there is a sense in which the Calvinists, and the Anglican Church was largely Calvinist, said, people are elect and God knows who he wants, and so evangelism was not the greatest priority. Calvinism is often, I think, misunderstood, because that's not what Calvin taught. And there are those who take Calvinism to an extreme. I remember when I went as curate to Port Kembla, the guy that I replaced had misunderstood Calvinism completely. I heard him preach after I was appointed, before I started. I went to one of his last services, and the sermon went for about 50 minutes, and it was as boring as all get out. It was very biblical, but it was boring. And the reason was, his view was, as a Calvinist, God will bring people to church that need to hear it, and as long as I preach the Bible, they'll be converted. No need for me to do anything to communicate. I just got to preach the Bible, and those that God wants, they'll be converted through it. Now that is not Calvinism. That's a really bad idea of Calvinism. Calvinism says God has chosen his people. Arminianism, or free will, says you have to actually get people converted. The two go hand in hand, and I remember Broughton Knox taught us at college, and this is brilliant. The preacher has to be an Arminian in the pulpit and a Calvinist on his knees. In other words, in the pulpit you say, you have to decide, you must be saved, you need to make a decision. And on your knees you pray, God, please make that decision. And the two go hand in hand, and they are the opposite sides of a coin. Don Robinson taught us it was like a suspension bridge, which is held up by the tension at either end. And if you release the tension on one end, the bridge sags and it's useless. And so predestination and free will, you hold in tension, and as long as they're held in tension, it works. If you release one of them, the whole thing falls apart. And I think that's significant. That's why the Wesleys were more concerned with evangelism than the normal church. And you'll remember the story, I've told you before. George Whitfield was the one who started it, but John Wesley then was asked to take it up. John Wesley got chucked out of the Anglican churches for preaching the gospel. How dare you do that? George Whitfield said, come out to Bristol and preach to the miners, which he did. And the Methodist Church started because the Anglican Church didn't want to evangelise. And so Wesley told his people, you go to the Anglican Church in the morning, you come to the Methodist meeting in the afternoon. And that's where they were taught, and they were evangelised, and they were taught to evangelise others. The two Wesleys travelled in 1735 to America as missionaries with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And they both experienced conversion, because on the way to America they'd spent time with the Moravians, and in America they spent time with the Moravians, who were about personal spiritual life and whose music influenced them. And they both experienced conversion in 1738, and John Wesley said, we went to Georgia to convert others, but we weren't converted ourselves. It came later. Charles wrote over 6,500 hymns, a much greater variety of meters than Watts, which is why he had to have tunes written for some of them. And so Handel wrote music for 3 of Charles's hymns. Sinners Obey the Gospel Word, which we don't sing anymore. O Love Divine, or Love's Excelling, and Rejoice the Lord is King. That music comes from Handel. John Wesley supervised all of the Methodist hymn books, and he wrote, I have been endeavouring for more than 20 years to procure a book such as this. This is a preface to one of the books, but in vain. Masters of music were above following any direction but their own. I was determined whoever should compile this should follow my directions, not mending our tunes, but setting them down neither better nor worse than they were. Now I put that there, we'll look at the rest of it and then I'll talk about why. How to sing. Teach them to sing by note and to sing our tunes first. Take care they do not sing too slow. Exhort all that can in every congregation to sing. Set them right that sing wrong. Be patient hearing. Yeah. The songs had to be accessible to all. Wesley was happy to adapt popular tunes. Church people really objected to that, but he was happy to use the popular music of the day. And I'll talk more about Charles Wesley later, but going back to that quote, he was having trouble with his hymn books because the people who knew music kept wanting to change things. Now, we had, when we got our new prayer book, a hymn book that went with it called the Anglican Hymn Book. The first one that came out was a real problem because the panel who produced it were musicians. Bartlett, the rector of Vaucluse, was the chairman of it, and the people were all really good musicians. The Catholic representative was John Walsh, who was the Catholic priest at Annandale when I was there, We used to beat each other up on the squash court once a week. And a lovely guy. And he said to me, Denis, I was taught philosophical theology. My people need to learn the Bible. Can you come and teach them? And I just go and take Bible studies for him. He preached in my church. He's a lovely guy. But he was a brilliant musician. And so the book that was produced was full of really good music. They left out all the good old hymns because they were too simple. And most of the hymns in it you couldn't sing because they were just too musically brilliant, but beyond the level of the ordinary congregation. And that's why in a lot of churches, rectors are told, don't let your musicians choose the music. Because they will choose stuff that is good for them, but may not mean anything to the congregation, or may not be able to be sung by the congregation. Wesley had that problem. If you want to produce stuff that ordinary people can sing, then you need to have an ordinary person who's not a musician involved in the process. Otherwise you end up with stuff that can't be sung. Now, the evangelical revival changed church life, and it also changed the whole of society. The basis of our common law came from the evangelical revival in England. Modern English law was very much based on that, and our morality, conservative morality, is still based on that. Now, in the 1960s, that was changed. People started to argue against it because, you see, the evangelical revival, people actually changed the law to suit their new religious convictions. And you justified the law by the Bible. And for 2 or 3 generations you did that. And then gradually as society moved away from the Bible, the basis for the law was no longer clear. And so by the time you reach the 60s, so my generation, when parents said, don't do that, why not? Because I said so. But why? They didn't have a clue. Had no idea of the background to it. Just that they've been taught you shouldn't do that, so therefore you shouldn't do it. And so in the 60s, people started to say, well, if we don't have any reason for this, let's change it all. And so morality changed in the 60s, and the law started to be changed from the 60s onward, because we no longer understood the basis. But the evangelical revival did all of that. Now, the evangelical revival was mostly local, and there were different leaders in different places. So every place had its own traditions, but by this stage there was enough movement that the traditions went through the land. And so hymns that were written, for example, were passed around. In one place, I forget the name of the town, I do know the minister was William Grimshaw. He used to set the congregation every so often singing Psalm 119, the whole psalm. And while they sang it, he'd go down to the pub with his whip and ran up all the young guys and take them back to church for the sermon. It was a different age. But you see, Psalm 119 is useful, isn't it?
For something.
Those were the days.
Yes. So the hymns of the evangelical revival, well, you know, Amazing Grace is probably the most important one. But again, remember this, Amazing Grace was made popular in America rather than England. It's much more popular in America than in England. In America, you had the Great Awakening, and there is a second Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was involved. There is no reasoning, nor are the lines made heavy with introspection. Tell the story simply as to a little child. The feelings are touched, the stiffest of us become children again. That's the basis of the music of the evangelical revival, both in England and in America. So the evangelical revival required hymns that people could sing and that were in fact evangelistic. And so we'll talk in detail next week about John Newton and William Cowper and the Olney hymns and the other hymns of that period. But they are meant so that people with no church background can come in and participate in the church service. And that's taken the next step by Moody and Sankey. Dwight L. Moody was an American evangelist, and Ira D. Sankey was the music leader. And he first visited England in 1872. But he was the first one to begin the crusade pattern that Billy Graham, for example, used. And his whole point was he would take a big auditorium, as I say, on one occasion 30,000 people, but big auditoriums, and people would be brought in who had no church background whatsoever. And there was a choir led by Sankey, and the songs were written specifically for it, and they were simple, they were easy to sing, and they were evangelistic. And so you got the crowd singing, and that built up the atmosphere for the preaching. Now it continued on Billy Sunday right through to Billy Graham. Music was vital. Sankey produced a book called Sacred Songs and Solos, which, when you do numerous things. And it's interesting, he called them sacred songs, not hymns. Now, most of them we now include in our hymn book as hymns. But I think the problem was the hymn suggested church and something that was formal and boring. And so he called them sacred songs. I don't think there was any meaning beyond that. And as I say, most of them we would talk about as hymns. Music was an integral part of all of the work of the evangelists. There was the growth of Sunday schools, so children who had never had any church background were brought in and were taught to read and write. The purpose of the Sunday school was not to teach the Bible, was to teach children to read and write because they couldn't get to school. But you taught them to read and write using the Bible. That was the purpose of it. The YMCA was really big, Young Men's Christian Association. And it was, in those days, Christian. It's no longer that. But it was in those days. And it was a means of young people coming, and young men would sing and so on, had services. And the songs were written for the Crusades. I mean, Fanny Crosby, her stuff is so simple. It's brilliant, but it's so simple. But it was written to be sung in Crusades by people who had no background at all, who were actually challenged by the words. The words were evangelistic. And that was true of most of the songs that were written at that time. William Booth said, and I love this, "Let us have a real tune. That is a melody with some distinct air in it that one can take hold of, which people can learn, nay, which makes them learn it, which takes hold of them, and it goes on humming in their mind. That is the sort of tune to help you. It will preach to you and bring you believers and converts." You see, we go back to the Colossians. It's teaching. Music is teaching. Music has to do more than just make you feel good. And music was a vital part of their ministry. Now, we forget, we think of the modern Salvation Army, which does good deeds. We forget that the Salvation Army was basically an evangelistic organisation, designed to take the gospel to the people who couldn't get to church because they were in the streets and they didn't belong in church and so on. And the whole purpose was to preach the gospel. And the social work was a means of preaching the gospel. William Booth once said You cannot preach the gospel to people who can't hear it because of the rumbling in their empty tummies. So you fill their stomach first, and then they can hear the gospel. And you need to understand the Salvation Army, unlike today where it's really basically about feeding the hungry and so on, the basic thing was to take the gospel to the unchurched, and to do that you actually had to feed them, clothe them, provide homes, that sort of thing, so that they could in fact respond to the gospel. I was going to talk about African music. I won't do that. We did do a whole 3 hours on that. But that had a big influence on American music in North America, which I'll start with next week. The music of the Africans came with the slaves. The music allowed them to survive. They would sing it in the fields while they worked so that they could survive. And it affected the church, it affected pop music. It, of course, is what made rock and roll. I have a tape at home somewhere, I can't find it at the moment, one day I'll find it, of Cowboy Jack Clement. Now, Jack Clement was an engineer at Sun Studios, and he wrote stuff for Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison and Elvis Presley, and he was very much involved with the early days of Elvis. And he sat in his office, and I was interviewing him with a guitar, and he played a song, a Negro spiritual, and he said, the first verse he played it, and he said, that is how a black man would sing it. And then he sang the second verse, he said, that's how a white man would sing it. And then in the third verse he put the two together, and you could hear rock and roll come into being. It's the most incredible experience I've ever had from this guy who was there at the beginning. And the reason it was so familiar to him, he said to me, I grew up in Memphis, poor, but the kids around me I didn't like. And I went across the road and played with the black kids. And so as a natural part of his being, he had this mixture of white and black. Mm. And it was just an amazing experience to sit and listen to him put the two together and create rock and roll in front of me in his room, you know, and that's... All right, let's start with North America next week. We'll do that for the first 15 minutes, then we'll play music.